So we've been getting ourselves kind of ready for learning, and now we're at that moment where we're going to dive in and really start to understand, well, what is the solar taxonomy? And again, this might be something that you've already had some experience with and you want to kind of refresh your knowledge, or it might be a totally brand new concept to you. Whatever the case, we're going to guide you through a little bit more information and a little bit more input around exactly what the solar taxonomy is. So Tom, tell us all about it.
Well, let's start with taxonomy, and I think that's a word that's a crucial element of understanding the particular framework for learning that the solar taxonomy is. By the way, SOLO is the word SOLO is an acronym, and we're going to dig into what those parts actually mean. But we're going to begin just by thinking about what a taxonomy is. And when I think about a taxonomy, I'm thinking about how it's something to do with classifying or identifying or naming something. And so just as we would have a taxonomy for different animals or spotting birds or basically identifying and classifying anything, we have with the solar taxonomy, a taxonomy for learning. And so this is we found this a really useful way of thinking about what the framework is, its purpose, and the way we can actually apply it, because it's at its core, it's to do with being able to classify learning that's taking place, being able to identify it, being able to recognize it when it's happening, and to know what to do with it. And so the rest of this chapter really helps us sort of dig a bit deeper into what solar taxonomy actually is. And we also, Chris, we're also keen to kind of stay true to some of the original intent from the researchers who generated this to begin with. And so John Biggs and Kevin Collis back in the early 80s developed the solar taxonomy, this particular framework. And I just want to dwell just a little bit longer on the way that they describe what the taxonomy provides us. If you have a quick look at the text here that's up on the screen. So they're talking about both something that has simplicity, but also robustness, which is a great combination, a way of describing learning. So that's a crucial thing. Again, it's being able to give us some identifiers, a way to classify. And it's the last part of this that we're drawn to, this idea that learning outcomes grow in complexity. And so that's something that we know, if we've ever been in a classroom, we know that those are complex environments to work and to learn in. And so when we're in the kind of midst of that complexity, we have to have really strong frameworks, really clear, robust frameworks to help us to understand what's going on. And Chris, just at the end of this line here, the Biggs and Collis refer to deep to conceptual understanding as well, don't they?
Mm. I think that's a really important piece, is to, when we talked about the concept bubble, if we're working at conceptual understanding is the understanding of all of the elements that make up a concept. And we kind of go, okay, so that makes sense to me. The kind of top end of this taxonomy is going to be showing conceptual understanding. Deep understanding might be, we're nearly at that conceptual level. We're not quite able to go beyond it or to kind of spread out. And then that surface level might be, we know a little bit of information about this concept, but we're definitely not kind of getting the whole picture there. And I always think in my mind, it's almost like, when you're stepping into a swimming pool, or you're kind of right here, I'm in the shallow end now, it's okay. I'm going to get into this deeper piece now, and kind of I'm feeling all of this information, all this water's kind of coming around me. And it might be that bit, I don't know if you used to do this when you were a kid, Tom, you kind of sit down in the bottom of the pool and hold your breath, and you're kind of, right, I'm in the element now, I totally get this thing. So I love that description. I just, as you said, I love the idea of it being simple and robust, but also complex. So it's really looking at complexity. So it's a wonderful taxonomy, of which we are great fans. But Tom, it is not the only taxononomy. And I think what we have to do is just clarify something.
We do like a taxonomy, though, don't we, in education? So, and this is a bit of a mashup, bit of a smackdown, Bloom's versus Solo. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about, because I reckon we're all pretty familiar with Bloom's. Maybe some of you out there are less familiar with Solo, but we also, we kind of understand a little bit about what a taxonomy potentially does. So Chris, maybe we can just explore this smackdown.
So the idea, I think, behind Bloom's taxonomy is always looking at that level of cognitive challenge of a task. So I might look at a task which is, this is about just remembering. And I said just, I shouldn't be pejorative. Remembering is incredibly important. So this task is about remembering, understanding. I'm going to create a task which is about kids applying knowledge. I'm actually going to get kids to analyze. I'm going to get them to evaluate, and I'm going to get them to create. And obviously, we're doing a solo course, not a Bloom's course, but looking back at the history of Bloom's, that whole thing of creation and evaluating flipping, I think in the early 2000s. But in all cases, what Bloom's does is it says this activity is this cognitive level of difficulty. And what we want is to activate higher order thinking by getting students as quickly as possible into a space maybe where they're applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Now that's great, and it's an incredibly useful model, and we use it all the time when we're designing learning. What Solo does, which is different, is that even if I design, let's say, an analysis level task, all of my 30 students that I'm working with are going to be showing a different level of complexity in their understanding within that task. So even though the task itself is analysis, I might have some students who are at a really kind of, I don't want to use all of the language yet because we're going to get into that at the moment, but kind of at the lower end of the conceptual understanding part of the taxonomy. And we might have some kids who are really up there and can apply a conceptual understanding of this task, this analysis task. So it's really important, just because they both are taxonomies, they actually are both really valuable, but they do serve very, very different purposes. So Bloom's is looking at a task and this cognitive difficulty. Solo is looking at the progress of an individual learner through the learning outcomes that are made visible in terms of the complexity going from surface to deep to conceptual understanding. So hopefully that makes sense, but it's a really important differentiator to put in there.
Okay, so let's actually look at that acronym, Chris. I think the acronym again is, we've looked at what a taxonomy is, but a bit of a smackdown there with, taxonomies that we know. Had a little bit of clarity about the difference. The acronym SOLO actually stands for something, doesn't it? And so this is a great and very important place to start for anybody starting to learn about the use of the taxonomy, and is actually what these words actually mean. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this, but one of the things that we haven't actually shown you yet is what the actual taxonomy looks like. And so for each of the different parts, the structure of the observed learning outcomes, we can represent those with different levels. And as we've kind of talked about, a student will progress through their learning with a particular outcome. Their understanding changes over time. And so let's have a look at the whole game, as they say, the whole picture, so you can understand what we mean when we say the Solo taxonomy. This is the Solo taxonomy in all of its glory. We have 5 different levels. We've kind of created these little hexagonal graphics to represent learning, understanding, and how that understanding changes, working from the bottom up here up to the top right. And you can see on the diagram here, there's a range of different language, certainly in the middle, that is some of the original language that was developed by Biggs and Collis. We've got pre-structural, unistructural, multi-structural, relational, and extended abstract. And so if you recall from their initial quote, this is going from the bottom, going through from a surface level through to the top right here to a conceptual level of understanding. And we're going to spend a bit of time exploring each of these different parts now, just so that we can really deepen our appreciation for what they stand for, what they mean. And this is, though, the core framework that we're going to be using. There's going to be many ways that you see, many different versions of this that you see, including different language that we might use for students. But this is the core framework, isn't it, Chris?
Absolutely. And just thinking about, I always think about this when I look at it, because I think it's very beautiful. That idea of those first two sort of pre-uni and multi, or that surface level. I'm getting to the surface level understanding. That deep level is really relational, and then that conceptual level is that extended abstract. And the kind of, I think you often use the word liminal, Tom, the kind of the stepping between relational to abstract, the extended abstract is kind of stepping through that concept bubble. And I always think about quantity and quality. So often the first couple of levels there, that pre-structural, which is in fact an absence of quantity, but unistructural, multistructural, I'm building up a quantity of information, a quantity of elements, and then it goes into quality. And relational and extended abstract are absolutely about quality of thinking and understanding. So do you want to take us through maybe each of those separate sections?
Yeah, let's have a look at them like individually. So what we can do here is we can just explain and try to contextualize. This is also a challenge to you to think about students that you're working with, even yourself. I think it would take some time as we're explaining these different levels to reflect upon what does this mean for you, and put it into your own context to make it work. So at a pre-structural level, a pre-structural phase, a learner or somebody learning something is yet really to be able to share any relevant ideas about a particular topic. So this is really early on. This is before they've even really begun to establish this particular conceptual framework or a schema in their mind. They maybe are yet to be introduced to a new topic. On our diagram or our graphic, we've just got a little hexagon with some dotted lines. So they're yet to be formed, but it's going to be there. We know that those pieces are going to come together.
And it's not a bad place to be, right?
Pardon?
It's not a bad place to be, Tom.
We're all often in that place, though, aren't we? Before we've actually been introduced to something new, there's always this phase where we didn't even know that this was a thing. I often think about how I was when I was learning to drive the car. So learning to drive a car for me kind of came late. And so there was a time when I was watching everybody else do it, but I didn't really know, what I needed to do to kind of learn that. And I think that's just an interesting period of time for our students and ourselves, where we are all going to experience pre-structural. And so this sort of time when we are yet to form the cognitive structures or the cognitive framework that actually will eventually be the conceptual understanding that we have. So useful to stay centered on the language here, Chris, isn't it? The pre-structural part, the pre-structure.
I was just thinking from my point of view as an educator, I've just done my concept bubble. So I did my concept bubble on geography and plate tectonics. I'm like, if I say to a student, we're looking at plate tectonics and the impact on geological activity, and they kind of look at me blankly because none of those words connect with them, then that's a really good example of them being at a pre-structural level. And it's fine. It's a great place to be. It means there's new learning to come.
So when we move on to the next level, we're thinking about a student or ourselves being able to share one or very few basic ideas. So unistructural, we're kind of used to that language, obviously one. So one idea or very few. And also we're kind of noticing those students who potentially need lots of support and scaffolding in order to be able to share those basic ideas. And so we're establishing the sort of cognitive structure. The schema is beginning to be formed, but they need a lot of support to be able to do that with a great deal of independence. And this is the first sort of major step towards a deeper understanding. But we're definitely in that time where we're trying to build up many ideas. The quantity of ideas is the important part in this particular phase.
So as a kind of geography teacher, I might be saying to my students who are demonstrating a pre-structural understanding of geological activity, I might ask them the question, well, do you know what a volcano is? And my year 9 will say, of course I do. Of course I know what a volcano is. Okay, well, that's that first step, moving from pre-structural. So volcano is a geological activity. So you've got one already. And it's often about activating previous knowledge and helping students move forward. And I would also say, Tom, you don't stay in the pre-structural and the unistructural stage for very long. I think it's important to note that this is not a linear taxonomy. If you spend an equal amount of time in each of these, we're kind of really moving as quickly as we can into multistructural and then relational, which we're going to explore right now.
I think actually multistructural. So again, let's just kind of check in with the language. So many, structural. So we're forming many ideas to form that cognitive structure or that schema of understanding. So there's more to it. There is more sides to it. There are more ideas in there. They have the potential to be connected, but a key distinction between this and a deeper level of understanding is that a student showing multi-structural level of understanding, they are yet to be able to make those connections. But like you said, Chris, this is actually the point where probably most of our students will kind of come in at. Like they will begin with some understanding. That understanding will be enough to kind of make to begin with, and it will often be multi-structural. They'll have many ideas, but they haven't yet figured out how to connect those ideas. But it might be a few of those individual facts or labels of specific things, particular kind of, you were talking about volcanoes. They might even be able to tell you from things that they've experienced and watched on documentaries and films, a few sort of shreds of information and ideas that are relevant, but they're not connected. And that's the thing that we're looking for, isn't it? The kind of the lack of connection.
And there's always a really important, I always stop at this point when I'm thinking through learning outcomes, my intended learning outcome, which is all about, at this point, looking at geological activity and plate tectonics. Like, I know that even though my student knows about volcanoes, knows about earthquakes, etc., they haven't nailed that down and they haven't got onto my learning outcome. So always remember that we're looking at the learning outcome which you've defined, and we're looking at the understanding of the students, what they show us visibly based around that learning outcome. So they might be able to name 4 different types of volcanoes, and that's good, that's useful, but it's just swimming around the outside of my learning outcome. So I'm really trying to get them at this point, multi-structurally, to know what the core of the Earth is, what the mantle is, what heat is, what heat energy is, what convection is. And they might not have connected all this stuff together yet, but they're starting to get all of those elements, which are really important to my learning outcome, which is why that concept bubble activity is such an important starting place when we're designing concept-based learning around the solo taxonomy.
So at the multi-structural level, a student will be sharing many ideas. We often say, and so far we've had, not yet one idea or a few, and many ideas. And this is all quantity. So it's all about gathering pieces. And the bridge from this stage to the next is one of the most important, because the next phase is called relational. And so a student would be showing you, or you'd be able to see a relational level of understanding. So a range of ideas have been shared. The connections, links, and relationships are also explained accurately. So they're not just able to independently, confidently, with great recall and accuracy, share a set of relevant ideas. They can talk about why they're connected in different ways. Maybe you test those connections. Maybe you explore some different relationships, such as the links between earthquakes and volcanoes and why those are so important. They're not just sort of separate phenomena. They obviously have causes that are very, very similar in terms of Chris's example that he was sharing. So when you're thinking of this one, again, look at the language, relational. So this is about the relationship of ideas, the relationships and connections between the ideas that your students can share.
And that's why I think when you are drawing up your concept bubble, it's so useful for you to actually draw those lines between elements, between kind of sub-concepts or little pieces of concept, is to draw those lines between them. And I often write on them, what is that connection? Because that's a really important part of this, is understanding how things connect together. And my example for this one might be, okay, so I understand plate tectonics. I understand that plates move because of the convection in the mantle. So I know that movement's happening, and I know there are different types of plate boundaries. And so I'm starting to connect all this together. And then I'm like, oh, so now I can see why volcanoes are linked to that convection, as are earthquakes through other types of plate movement as well. So really getting to that stage of, I've got it. I'm kind of really conceptually getting this. I think the thing for me, Tom, that I always kind of wonder about, and this is learning is a very complex and messy thing, is you might think you're just in a relational understanding, and then you kind of, but actually I didn't quite get that, and you almost move back to multi-structural. So there's often a kind of really interesting movement between those two parts to get a really deep relational understanding, which is confidently expressed through one of the learning outcomes that students show you.
So we've got hexagons coming together here. We're going to be talking in a future lesson about activities that help you to really get a clear signal about some of these things. So anything that would help you to see connections and links, that's what we're working on within this particular level. And this would, in terms of how Biggs and Collis would describe learning, they describe this as being the deep level of understanding. And so we're in that, in a completely different territory. Let's look at the last one, and then we're going to look again at the overall framework and just make sure that you're clear about the whole structure. So relational is our fourth level, and the last one is called the extended abstract. So the extended abstract is a much more, it does what it says on the tin, okay? It extends, and we are abstracting. And so again, let's center on the language. So a learner is able to show you that the relationships between ideas within that outcome, within that concept, they can do that confidently. They can do that with some dexterity and some clarity. They're over time, maybe as well. So you've maybe been able to check over time that relational level of understanding. When we're looking to extend, we're going beyond that. We're really pushing some of that understanding a bit further, extending it maybe into new places. And the word abstract is an interesting one. It's often to do with identifying patterns and rules and being able to hypothesize. It's also, this one is much more associated with creative application of my knowledge or understanding to in new ways, in new forms. So maybe looking at kind of disaster management and planning, would be a fascinating way to apply, okay, I have a deeper conceptual understanding. I can now think carefully about how people would be able to respond in those kind of crises. That would be an interesting way to apply and do something creative with that knowledge. The extended abstract is an interesting phase, and as the language, the qualifier just underneath the extra text says, we're looking for connected concepts. So we're also bridging out to something that might be a schema or another concept that we've learned about, and making bigger connections, aren't we, Chris? So we're kind of bridging outwards.
And I often imagine, when I draw a concept bubble myself, I often imagine that concept is self-contained in many ways, but almost that kind of line, the line of the bubble, the outside line of the circle itself, is permeable. And it really is about, well, no concept really exists entirely on its own. And it's the extended abstract is, for me, exactly what you're talking about, being able to bridge through that kind of, the permeable membrane. I think I'm going biology now, but the permeable membrane of that concept, and go beyond it. So sometimes you might actually want to, on your concept bubble, just identify some things which are slightly outside the concept bubble, the concept itself, but are connected to other concepts. And this is where we always get into some fascinating kind of trying to visualize this. Is when we're talking about this idea of, these concepts never exist on their own. They're always connected to other bigger concepts, and the more of this concept you connect to this concept becomes part of a bigger concept, and that bigger concept connects to another concept, and another concept becomes part of a bigger concept. There's been some really great visualization of that through the Atlas of Scientific Literacy, which I'm sure we can drop a link to, Tom, below, which will take you and show you the idea of taking some. It's an American project. It's a fabulous project, taking some scientific concepts like gravity, or I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that are in there, light, or living things, which are those big concepts, and then they actually break it down by K to 12. So it's really interesting to see, these are the things you need to know at K to 2, I think it is, and then 3 to 6, and they kind of break it down in that way. It's really fascinating just to see how there's a huge concept like living things, that all of the smaller concepts within it and how they kind of interconnect. So it's a beautifully complex and hard thing. I think we need to make that really clear. This is not a quick fix solution where you can just go, oh, yeah, got it, nailed it. It is really challenging our thinking to understand how information, how new understanding, how conceptual understanding connects to other concepts. So in terms of using the taxonomy to help us to do that, it's such a powerful lens.
And so let's just quickly zoom back out again and see each of the different levels. And so this is everything that you've seen across those last few slides, exactly the same, just all in one place. And I just want to come back to something that Chris mentioned earlier, and this is an important consideration when you're starting to understand the taxonomy, is that each of these levels are not equal in time. And so that's a crucial thing. If you imagine that this is a journey that we want our students to take, then let's just think about some of the things that we've already said. We've said that students, learning growth for individual students is unique to them. And so they will chart their own course through this. Each of these different levels are not a standard amount of time. We're not thinking in those terms, even though they're neatly kind of set out on this slide. You know, it makes it easy for the slide and for us to understand it. But in reality, when we're in the classroom, when we're in our learning spaces with our students, it's really, really complex. And one thing we recognize is there is great complexity. And so what we're attempting to do, and it often is a great, you know, we're making strides to do that. And that's why we're all here, is to have a robust framework to be able to classify and recognize learning when it's taking place, but also the growth between the different levels. So your students may come in at, you know, multi-structural straight away, but they might stay there for a while as they build up a deeper appreciation for the different parts of a concept. They might show you glimpses of relational level of understanding. Maybe the next day, though, is something completely different. And I think that that's just the reality of working with students and working with learning. There's great mystery. There's a great complexity to it. And so there's times when we're moving deeper and to a more or closer to a conceptual level understanding. And it seems that sometimes maybe with a different question or a different task or a different activity, there is a slight difference in what we're actually seeing. And so we have to recognize that. We have to speak about it. We have to share and collaborate with our colleagues to understand what's going on. And so it's useful just to think of, though, that these levels are not equal in time. I'm not spending the same amount of time in each, nor does it necessarily mean that I will move to the next one just because I'm in multi-structural means my understanding will naturally be relational next. That's not true either, is it, Chris?
And I think one really big caveat to put against this, Tom, which I have come across and when I've worked with teachers around solo, is you can't use this as a grading system in a classical way. So you can't say that, you know, pre-structural is 0 points, unistructural is 1 point, multi-structural 2, then 3 and 4 for relational extended abstract, because it truly is a powerful tool to look at the complexity of learning. It's not a way to boil complexity of learning down to a simple numeric outcome. So I think that's a really important thing for us to understand as we move forward through the solo taxonomy.